Download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources at savantwealth.com/guides.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Savant Live webinar. Thank you for joining us. Today, we are discussing optimizing your inheritance. I'm your co-host, Dom Parillo, the Director of Wealth Transfer at Savant. And my team focuses on estate planning and wealth transfer strategies, as well as trust and estate administration. Also joining me today from the wealth transfer team is my colleague, Mike Cyrs. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and welcome to everybody in the audience. We're anxious to spend some time with you, and we're very grateful for the time that you're spending with us.
Awesome. We'll go ahead and dive in. So when Mike and I put this presentation together, we really did it with a key audience in mind, and that would be people, and you might find yourself in this category, that have just received a significant inheritance, or maybe you're expecting to receive a significant inheritance in the near future. And we oriented the topics around a lot of the key questions that we receive from the clients that we work with as wealth transfer advisors. So I think you're going to get a lot out of today's program. The first topic is usually the first question that comes up. Do I have to pay income tax? Or, is my estate going to be subject to estate tax now that I've received this inheritance? We want to give you some insights, some thoughts on that. We want to cover proper trust establishment for asset protection. What does that mean to you? Well, it's a good practice to review the terms of your own personal estate plan regularly. And certainly whenever there's a major life event, like the death of a parent or their loved one, a significant increase in your financial net worth, right, when you receive an inheritance. So we have some thoughts we want to provide to you on what to look out for when you are reviewing your own estate plan with your advisor. Some things that you could do to maybe, keep up with changed circumstances. Another topic is often, how does this inheritance potentially affect my investment strategies? We want to delve into a few ideas there. Also, this is somewhat related to that second topic, right? How can you position your own estate plan to work better for the next generation, your loved ones, whether that be your children or other important people in your lives? Things like trustee selection, how to get organized. We want to give you some tips and tricks there. And then the last big topic are just some common pitfalls that we see as estate planners. A little bit of recap of some of the topics we're going to cover, but some other ideas there too. And then at the end of the presentation, we're going to take questions that you can submit. So we'll turn the page. And Mike, can you give us some insights on income, estate, and gift tax concepts?
Sure. I'd love to, Dom. Let's get things started. So the first thing is there's kind of an interesting statistic out there that I read, and that is that in the next 20 years, before the year 2045, it's anticipated that between 72 and 84 trillion dollars will transfer from the baby boom generation to those generation members, more junior in nature, the second and tertiary generation. So if this is a topic that hasn't touched you yet, I think it is a topic. Hopefully, you're going to find a value, in the not too distant future. We really structured the program today to do two things. One, we have to give you sort of an understanding of the basics around what's happening when you receive an inheritance. I think that'll hopefully give you some comfort because you'll know sort of the foundational rules and what's going on from a tax perspective or from a planning perspective. And we need to do that because you need that foundation so that you can get into the strategy side of things and the optimization side. And so we're constantly going to be weaving sort of back and forth between the knowledge piece and the strategy side of things. And, that's the heart of our program today. How do you optimize that inheritance? So let's start where all things seem to begin and end, and that is with the taxation side of things. And there's some really good news here, and that is, as Dom kind of led in with, when you receive an inheritance or a gift during a lifetime, it is not subject to income tax. You're going to receive those assets. You don't have to add them to your 1040. They're not going to become part of your adjusted gross income. You don't have to withhold on those assets. You're just going to receive those assets and be off and running. Now, as with all things, there's some exceptions, and we're going to carve out into one group of exceptions, IRD assets. These would be assets that have grown on a tax advantage basis, traditional IRAs, 401ks, annuities that have grown tax deferred. They're going to continue to be an income tax component to those. And there's a lot of strategy around, taking those distributions because it involves timing and the pattern for distributions. So let's just lump those together for now. Let's take comfort that we're not going to have to pay any income tax, but let's carve out another exception. And that is, there is this period of time in the administration of an estate between the date of death and the time that the assets are distributed, that the assets are going to be taken out of the decedent's Social Security number. They're going to be re-registered under a new tax ID number that either a trustee or an executor is going to obtain, and they're going to trap those earnings, interest and dividends. And what that means is that either that EIN is going to file its 1041 and pay tax, or in more likelihood, it's going to push those assets out and carry to you as the beneficiary what's called distributable net income. And so through a K1, you're gonna be responsible for that interest, those earnings, those dividends in that period of administration. So the example, you receive $100,000 inheritance, you're not going to be subject to tax on that, but watch for that K1 and a little optimization strategy. Don't run out and file your 1040 too quickly. The K1 might come in later, then you'd have to amend your return, and that is not an optimization strategy. So you could even reach out to the fiduciary, say, want to make sure I'm not getting a K1, or if I am, when is it coming, and be careful of that. So second thing on the income tax that I want to talk about, and that's basis and capital assets. Okay, so if you receive assets in an inheritance and it's a taxable account, make sure that those assets have an adjusted basis to fair market value. So the custodian, for example, if it's a wire transfer and those are various grouping of stocks or what have you, make sure that somebody's adjusted basis to fair market value so that you'll have less capital gains tax later on. Super important step. If it's a piece of real estate, you want to get an appraisal in all likelihood. If you're going to sell the real estate right away, or in a very short period of time, perhaps the sale price becomes the fair market value as of the date of death. But if you're going to hold that asset, get an appraisal, put that appraisal in a safe place, and that's going to give you that basis adjustment. And again, higher appraisals, to the extent there's some wiggle room in there, is going to potentially save you capital gains tax later on when you ultimately dispose of those assets. So those are some of the basics. We're going to get into the estate and gift tax side of things as well. Wanted to cover the income tax side of things. And I always leave for Dom the thorny, sticky IRD asset category, specifically the Secure Act. So I'm going to pass it back to you, Dom, and then we'll get into some strategy here. I can talk about that as well. So take it away on the Secure Act.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for setting us up. So it's always important to go into a little bit more detail with some of the changes that occurred with the passage of the Secure Act. It was passed in 2019, but became effective in 2020 because this has changed the rules fundamentally for people that inherit tax-deferred retirement accounts, IRAs, 401ks, 403bs. And we increasingly see that those tax-deferred retirement savings type assets tend to be the bulk of assets that people have to live off of in retirement, and also the bulk of assets they get passed to their loved ones. So very common. If you've lost a loved one recently, you may have inherited an IRA account, or like I said, a 401k. So what are the big takeaways? And what do you need to watch out for? Well, prior to the passage and effective date of the Secure Act, if you received a retirement account in the form of an inherited IRA, let's say, you had basically your actuarial life expectancy to keep that account open for and take distributions from. So most tax advantage retirement plans have something called a required minimum distribution. If you're the original plan participant or owner of the IRA, your required minimum distribution starts between ages 72 and 75, depending on your birth date. But if you're the inheritor of the wealth, absent a spouse, and we'll get into a little bit more detail there, your required minimum distribution period is largely going to be 10 years now. And that was the big change with the Secure Act. We go from a sort of a life expectancy payout to a 10-year window, which accelerates the recognition of income tax, because every time you take $1 out of that plan that you inherit, that dollar goes right on your income tax return and it's taxed to your ordinary marginal income tax rate. So that's very important to keep in mind. And this was a big question when the Secure Act was passed is, okay, we know we have this 10-year window to work around, but is there a required distribution in each of the 10 years? And thankfully, the Treasury has given us some guidance in the form of final regulations. And if you, again, are subject to this 10-year rule, and the original IRA owner died after they were required to start taking distributions, they'd obtained RMD age, then you will have a required distribution in each of the 10 years based on your actuarial life expectancy. But again, the 10th year is the maximum outer limit that you can keep the account open. So all of the income eventually has to be realized within this 10-year time period, unless you're considered an eligible designated beneficiary. And we'll give you a sense of those categories on the next slide. So just as an example, you inherit an IRA account worth $1 million, right? If you took pro rata distributions, take it out equally over the 10 years, that's $100,000 of ordinary income that you'd have to realize every year within this 10-year period, which can significantly change your income tax bracket and affect some tax planning strategies. So you want to understand, what the impact of this tax-deferred retirement account has on you. Work with your advisor to come up with tax advantage withdrawal strategies. Try to minimize the income tax overall within the 10-year period. Okay, and I mentioned before that one of the exceptions to the 10-year distribution rule are for inheritors of IRA accounts that are considered eligible designated beneficiaries. So if you're considered an eligible designated beneficiary, instead of being subject to the 10-year rule that I described, you can actually stretch or take distributions over your remaining actuarial IRS life expectancy. So if you're the spouse of the decedent, you have a lot of options. You can actually roll that account over into your own name and wait until your applicable RMD age, either 70, between 70 and 70, 72 and 75 in the future. You can leave it in an inherited IRA. There's a little bit of strategy there. Okay, so surviving spouse is one category. If you leave your IRA to minor children under the age of 21, up until that age 21, there's a small required distribution based on the life expectancy of that minor child. But upon attaining age of majority, again, age 21, the 10-year rule would then kick in. So the entire account would have to be depleted, at age 31 over a 10-year period. If you're a chronically ill or disabled individual, you can use life expectancy. And then if you are an individual that was not more than 10 years younger than the IRA, and a lot of times this is a sibling that that inherits the IRA, then you can also use your own life expectancy there. So it's important to identify whether you are in one of these eligible designated beneficiary categories, because there's the opportunity to defer income tax beyond the 10-year period and basically save income tax, a little bit more flexibility in the plan. And Mike and I put this graphic together as well, just to illustrate some of the decisions that you'll have if you're determining how you want to set up your own IRA beneficiaries for your own accounts that you've accumulated. One thing that I forgot to mention is that once that 10-year period starts, if you're not considered an eligible designated beneficiary, that sort of sets the clock and the maximum period that the account can be open for. So if you name successor beneficiaries on your account in the 10-year period, you pass away before the end of the 10th year, your successor beneficiaries basically just continue out that 10-year schedule. But A lot of us, like I said, have our own retirement savings vehicles that we've contributed to, and you have a lot of options on how you might set up your own beneficiary designations. Go ahead, Mike. Give a
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things from the optimization side here. I think that the disabled beneficiary, a lot of individuals, you receive an inheritance and some inherited assets, you still can stretch, and the stretch is extremely valuable. So if you have if there's a disabled grandchild or disabled child, you still can get a 50 or 60 year minimum distribution period, and it can be extremely valuable from the planning perspective to funnel that account, into a trust for that disabled individual. That is still a gold status as an eligible designated beneficiary. The other structure that I would point out is the estate is always going to be trouble. So, if you receive it a piece of as an inheritance, an IRA, don't delay in naming new beneficiaries and getting down to business on things, because if something happens to you and somehow there's no paperwork and the default is back into the estate, you're going to back yourself into what is the avoidance sector. Like, you want to stay away from that 5-year rule. So don't delay, choose your new beneficiaries, look at your estate plan, consider perhaps the possibility, at least with respect to the to your other IRA, the disabled beneficiary trust structure. And then the last thing I would note is on the charity side of things, because we now have the 10-year rule, charities, you don't have this deferral. When you had the long deferral that we used to have with respect to minimum distributions and in the stretch IRA, so to speak, you have these very long distribution periods. Now it's just 10 years if it's not an eligible designated beneficiary, kind of smashing the tax. What better asset to use if you can avoid tax? Take the charitable bequest out of your estate plan and perhaps replace it with it doesn't even have to be all of the inherited piece of IRA. It could just be a percentage, 10% or 15%. Now that high tax piece that's been shortened because of the Secure Act, you're going to get rid of the tax on that piece, and the charity's going to get it 100%. So just a couple of strategies there. Any other thoughts on that, Dom?
Oh, I'm glad you mentioned the charitable piece on the right-hand side of this illustration. If you are philanthropic, leaving your IRA type assets are a great way to meet that charitable or philanthropic goal that you have, because the charity is a 501c organization, doesn't pay any income tax. So you can shift some of the sort of tax loaded, high income tax embedded assets to the charity and leave more of your, after tax capital gain types assets to your children. Just reiterating something you said, on the left-hand side, the other extreme, and Mike, I think you did a great job pointing this out. If you fail to name a beneficiary on your beneficiary form, oftentimes your estate becomes the default beneficiary. And as Mike said, that can have pretty negative income tax implications for your ultimate beneficiaries. You go from a 10-year rule to a 5-year rule, or if you die after your required beginning date, maybe a ghost life expectancy. Basically, if you die after age 82, that ghost life expectancy period is less than 10 years. So really important to get deliberate, name beneficiaries, think about the income tax implications. In the middle of the diagram, next to the charitable beneficiary, you speak about leaving assets in trust. We're going to give you a little bit of insight into what you might want to do there. Because oftentimes, right, your intended beneficiaries might not have the financial maturity. Maybe you have some doubts about their ability to manage assets on their own accord. You can leave IRA assets in a trust, but trap for the unwary, you want to work with your attorney to make sure that that trust qualifies as a see-through trust to optimize tax deferral within the 10-year period. And then it's always going to be sort of a balancing act of income taxes and trust protection for a beneficiary. If you leave assets outright to a beneficiary, the top marginal tax rate of 37% currently for a single filer is $626,000 roughly. For a married filer, somewhere around $751,000. Well, the top income tax bracket for a trust is $15,650. So again, some of that income that might be realized over the 10 years could get trapped at the trust bracket, higher marginal rate, but maybe there's some asset protection benefits. So a lot of decisions, very helpful diagram. It's good to work with your advisor and your tax accountant to figure out exactly what is the best course of action for you, given your situation, your overall estate planning goals. And Mike, earlier you said that there's often important estate and gift tax considerations as well. Can you give our listeners some insights there?
Sure. I'm going to just close out just the income tax side piece with just a couple of other optimization ideas. Otherwise, I'm afraid we might cloud the waters up here a little bit for the audience. But remember, as a principle, these assets that you receive are not subject to income tax except for the IRD assets and except for the K-1. That doesn't mean you can't take those assets and start doing things with them, as if they are earned income. So, for example, you might have been contributing to a 401k account, after tax, or pre-tax, I'm sorry. And now because you didn't have the resources, you didn't have the financial ability to get it in there, after tax to pay the tax. So you might change your 401k to a Roth 401k, use these assets to pay the tax. You might you might have been reluctant to do a Roth conversion on some assets because you didn't have the resources to pay the tax. Again, it may make sense in more of a long-term planning sense. Now I can do the Roth conversion. Now I can fund a 529 account for a grandchild or for someone else. Get it into, even, we know there's no income tax due. Get it into these tax deferred growth areas. Stretch the assets to the extent that you can on the IRD side. Maybe it's making up some makeup contributions based on your age to a Roth IRA or something like that. Get it working for you. Getting it optimized. So again, kind of thematically looking backward, knowing what the rules are, but looking forward as well from an optimization standpoint. All right, let's leave the income tax behind and let's move on to the estate tax side of things. Equally good news here, at least currently. The threshold for federal estate tax in the United States is at an all-time high at $13.99 million per person. So what does that mean? Anybody below that, you can have that much wealth, a single individual, leave that to family members, and there's going to be no estate tax. The 40% tax rate starts when you get above that threshold. So 28 million essentially for a couple, 14 million for a child. The credits are portable from one spouse to another. This is a historical high. It is scheduled to decline under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act expiration or sunset provisions later this year. If Congress and the president do not act to extend those provisions, it would get cut in half. But even at half, it's still, probably out of reach for a lot of people. So a lot of what you would receive, not subject to federal income tax or federal estate tax, I'm sorry, but watch out for the state estate tax. There are 17 states in the United States that have a much lower threshold from a state estate tax perspective. Could be 2 million, could be 4 million. And there might be some tax due if you're receiving an inheritance, because you might ultimately be responsible as a receiving party if the fiduciary doesn't do their job. You might make sure, have all the I's been dotted and the T's been crossed, the taxing Department of Revenue Authority has been paid, so that I know my inheritance is coming to me without any hidden obligations, so to speak. A couple of strategy things here. We never know where things are going to go from a federal estate tax perspective. So even though we have a significant comfort level today, we might not have that same comfort level 5, 10, 15 years from now. Wasn't that long ago, the Build Back Better Act and the American Families Plan were proposed, and they were proposing a 3.5 million federal estate tax credit per person, or even in some circles, a $2 million estate tax credit. Estate taxes could come back. So you might avail yourself of a technique. It's called a disclaimer or qualified disclaimer, where you essentially block receiving the asset. You say, like, I'm not going to take this into my estate. I'm going to treat it as if I predeceased and allow it to go perhaps to your children or to the next generation. And then, it could end up, being taxable income to them if it's an IRD asset and you disclaim. So you might have a nice, income shifting to a lower income tax bracket. You might just keep it outside of your state. Maybe you're in a state estate tax situation already, or possibly a federal estate tax situation. So disclaimers can be a super powerful optimization technique. Another technique on this side is the annual exclusion. So if you receive the inheritance and now you say, gosh, I wish I hadn't done that, I'm past the period of time of which I could have made a qualified disclaimer, you could take those resources, put them in an irrevocable trust under what's called the annual exclusion, which allows you to gift $18,000 per year, exempt from federal estate tax per individual. And that's, of course, then $38,000 per couple. You could move that into an irrevocable trust outside your estate, earmark it with restrictions that it's only to be used for education or healthcare, down payment on a home, a startup of a business, a wedding. So you can restrict it until the beneficiary gets to be a much more mature age and settled in marriages, maybe age 35 or something like that. So again, the idea is optimize the inheritance. I'm going to take 80% of this inheritance into my estate and work with it and use it, but I might take 20%, push it down to that next generation, restrict it and identify it. Now I'm going to optimize it for generational planning there. So the next slide shows us some of the states that have estate tax or inheritance tax. And you can see there the 17 that are grouped together and maybe identify that one of them is indeed your jurisdiction. So that's kind of the wrap up on the estate tax side. And anything you have to add here, Dom, or should we keep on trucking down the road here?
Let's keep on trucking. We have some good information, and I think some of your commentary on the estate and gift tax exemptions will make a little bit more sense as we go into the next few slides.
All right. Okay, so here's an optimization technique. So you received this inheritance. Okay, we put together a bit of a diagram, and you can see in this diagram we have separate trusts for a husband and a wife here, revocable trusts, and a pretty common structure. It creates at death a yellow trust here, a credit shelter trust for the benefit of the surviving spouse. So, we'll call client number one husband here. He receives the inheritance. Okay. And what we can do is make sure these assets are in the husband's trust. They're going to stay in there. They are going to then drop at death for the benefit of the surviving spouse so that they can use them. They can be the trustee. There's lots of flexibility. As the next slide would show here, they're available to them, but we know that those assets are going to end up driving down to the next generation. They're going to stay in the family. Okay, we're not going to commingle them and make them, common community assets or marital assets. We're going to optimize them in the sense that we're going to keep them in the bloodline, keep them in the family. Very simple and easy to do. The next slide here will show those assets dropping down into that family trust, and then ultimately into the separate children's trusts. And nice technique. If you don't have separate trusts right now, and again, the trust would be there to avoid probate. If you have a single trust, okay, you might go into separate trust, because if you put it in a single trust and retitle the account, now all of a sudden, from an asset protection standpoint, it might be considered, both spouses' assets. And if you're trying to sort of separately identify it, that would be, you'd be running against the current of that asset protection technique. But what you could do is either reformulate your estate plan into the two trust type of structure, or keep the joint trust. And if you have a credit shelter trust built in, a family trust, the yellow trust there at the first death, you could name that trust POD, payable on death, or TOD, transfer on death beneficiary, so that those assets will drive down into that structure. And again, if there's a 20 or 30 year overlife of a surviving spouse, a lot of different things can happen. And you might want to make sure that inheritance is only for the surviving spouse and then only for the descendants. And, that would be an optimization technique there. So we wanted to make sure we brought that up. Any other comments there or closing comments on the next slide there, Dom, on IRA assets and driving those through?
Yeah, Mike beautifully explained on how the family trust funding works within the context of your estate plan. So just tying this back to how it can impact your own estate tax situation. Mike covered the exemptions at the federal level earlier, $13.99 million per person. Your state of residence will dictate whether your estate is subject to state estate tax at your death. So it's important to keep those numbers in mind. The big thing is understanding the structure of the inheritance that you receive. If it's an outright distribution to you, that's just going to get added to your estate. Mike highlighted the importance of reevaluating your own estate plan to make sure that you're optimizing opportunities to shelter assets from the surviving spouse's estate, if that makes sense. I know there's a portability feature that exists under federal rules. That might not be the same for the state that you live in, okay? Sometimes you have to use up the full exemption in the state that you live in at the first death, otherwise you lose the benefit. So, understand the impact of the inheritance on your future estate tax exposure, and just make sure you have the right structure in place and are using gifting techniques to mitigate any estate tax that is coming down the road. And then we got to tie it back to the IRA concept, Mike, right? And as I was saying earlier, when we showed that that sort of continuum of different options that you have when it comes to naming beneficiaries and the deferral implications of the beneficiary status, when you're going to be faced with a decision, what do I do with my own IRA assets as far as beneficiary designations go, and what do I do with the IRA assets that I've inherited? And I want to just make another point clear again is that when you're in that 10-year payout period, that sort of sets the pace for the rest of time while that account's open, even after your death, if you pass away before the end of the 10 years. So I just want to make sure we don't lose sight of that point I made. But you're going to be faced with the decision of, well, do I want to leave my IRA assets to my beneficiaries outright and free of trust just by naming them as direct people on the form? Or do I want to coordinate, for example, my beneficiary designations for trusts that I'm establishing for my loved ones after my death? And Mike spoke about a couple of examples as to why you might want to do that. And the big takeaway from this slide is that when you leave assets to a beneficiary, it's very simple, straightforward. The claims process, any distributions in the applicable RMD period are going to be taxed at that beneficiary's individual tax rates, which are high, as I had said before, before you get to that highest marginal tax rate. Downside is that there's a lack of asset protection and control over those assets. The beneficiary is naturally incentivized to keep mind of income tax that might be due upon the withdrawals, but there's nothing stopping that beneficiary from draining the account, for example, in year one, taking the income tax hit, and then using the money for something that you might not have envisioned, or maybe they're not. Their priorities are much different because they're younger, right, at the time of the inheritance. So the option is to instead leave those IRA dollars in trust. Trade-off there is higher administrative complexity, and then as I had mentioned earlier, the more compressed trust income tax brackets, to the extent that the IRA withdrawals stay in further trust for the 10-year period, and they're held for that beneficiary's benefit. So this graphic should give you, I know it's busy, but a visualization of some of the options that you have. So we've got options number 1 and 2, which I'm going to group together because more often than not, we see people naming their spouse as the primary beneficiary if they're married, and then their children as the contingent or secondary beneficiaries as outright takers. And as Mike said, it might be important to you to protect those assets in trust for your spouse, especially if you have a blended marriage situation. Maybe you're trying to do some advanced estate tax planning. You have a federal or state taxable estate. So you have the option of naming a family trust, for example, as the beneficiary of that IRA in the event that a spouse survives you, to shelter those assets and protect those assets. You just want to work with your attorney to make sure that there's provisions that maximize the income tax deferral opportunities for that spouse via conduit provisions. And I'm using some terminology that might be unfamiliar to you, but that's okay. Just be mindful, right? You can name a trust as the beneficiary of an IRA account to accomplish a lot of different goals. You've just got to be very careful and put attention into the particular terms in your trust. Okay, so you can protect assets for a spouse, shelter assets from estate tax, protect against a potential remarriage. I think you mentioned that earlier, Mike. A lot of reasons why you might want to do a trust for your spouse. Children, right? If they're the outright takers of the IRA account, that means that they have full access and unfettered access to those funds, regardless of what their ages are or their station in life, because the beneficiary designation on your IRA trumps the written terms of your estate plan. So oftentimes it's important for parents to provide a little bit of protection in the form of a trust. And you might have children that are well into adulthood, have families of their own. Well, a trust can provide for contingency planning if, God forbid, one of your children or loved ones predeceases you, or you might want to have those IRA assets held for young beneficiaries in the form of a trust. And again, special attention needs to be put into the status of the trust to make sure that we're maximizing the income tax deferrals for the trust and the beneficiaries. So a couple of thoughts there. Mike, do you have any thoughts on some of the other strategies or ideas?
Yeah, a couple of things, Dom. Thanks very much. So here's pretend this asset is the inherited asset. You could keep that, and this was a joint trust situation. I was explaining this a little bit earlier. You could just put a POD or a TOD designation, on that asset and keep it outside the trust. That would get it to funnel into this asset protection, type of structure, for the surviving spouse. So just a little bit of a clarification there. The IRA over here, if you name the spouse, if you have an inherited IRA, you're going to be stuck with a 10-year unless you are the spouse. You're going to be already in the non-designated eligible designated beneficiary structure. So what you might do then, you got to work these different categories together. You might use your own IRA that you have, not your inherited piece, and have that go into this yellow credit shelter trust for asset protection planning. You'll get a minimum distribution period equal to the surviving spouse's life expectancy, which is still a very long minimum distribution period. You're not going to get the dual table that you would get, so not that type of benefit, but still significant deferral. You're going to get significant asset protection so that those IRA assets are going to come down, down here below. And as you said, Dom, it gets pretty busy here, but I want to go back to, because I saw a question in the queue on the disabled beneficiary. That's easier to do than you might think. It would be a supplemental needs trust or a special needs trust, and the assets would flow in there. The RMD would be stretched out over the life expectancy of the disabled beneficiary. So you'd be taking them out, and then if you weren't using them for supplemental needs, you want to make sure the benefits stay in place. You'd keep them in trust in a taxable account. So they'd merely be coming out of the IRA type of an account on a very prolonged basis, very optimized income tax basis, go into this other, not to the beneficiary. So they're going to stay, and then they're going to be in a taxable account available, but still in the supplemental needs trust. So a pretty powerful technique there. But again, there's just a lot that you need to work through. A lot of different strategy here, a lot of opportunities, and that's kind of the point that we're making here. Beneficiary alignment is critical. So we see this all the time. We work with our clients, our internal wealth transfer team here, and there are a lot of opportunities out there, and you have to really kind of work the equation and get the fact pattern down, because there's some great opportunities to make sure that the wiring is correct. You can have a great estate plan, but terrible wiring causing very inefficient tax consequences, and you can use the stacking of these beneficiaries. And again, on the disabled beneficiary structure, say for instance there's a senior generation and there's a person who has a disabled child, you might talk to mom or dad and say, hey, if we set up the supplemental needs trust, we can run these assets in there, and you can name, mom, or dad, you can name mom as primary beneficiary, and then name the secondary beneficiary this supplemental needs trust for the disabled grandchild. So you can actually even start to get maybe a little bit proactive with respect to some of the structure. So let's move on and talk about some of the investments a little bit, Dom, if you can, and get into what happens. You receive this inheritance. It's gonna change your risk profile. You now have other assets in your portfolio, and you need to make changes. And let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is another big question. right? How does this inheritance that I just received impact my investment strategy, right? Should I make any changes? And I think it's important just to cover just some fundamentals, right? What is your asset allocation, right? Understanding what your investment strategy is under the hood. Your asset allocation at a high level is just the mix of different asset classes you own. You can see on the screen, we have three different buckets of major asset classes: stocks, right? Equity and publicly traded companies, for example, bonds, fixed income instruments, and then alternatives, things like real estate, reinsurance, treasury, inflation protected securities. And that mix of assets that you ultimately choose will have an impact on the overall volatility and expected return of your portfolio. So let's just say you do inherit $500,000, $1 million. Maybe that means that you can take a little bit of risk off the table. Get a little bit more conservative in your portfolio, right? Maybe you want to grow the assets at a more aggressive rate for future generations, right? It's good to have a discussion with your investment advisor to determine what changes you might want to consider. And I think a really practical point is to not forget about your financial plan, right? That portfolio design that you ultimately choose to employ has an impact on things like, when can I retire, right? Important questions. How much can I spend in retirement? What if, leaving an inheritance or bequest to your children is important. It's good to understand how the addition of these new monies can impact your goals. Maybe you can retire earlier, right? Maybe you can help out your young adult children with major life purchases like down payments on homes, weddings, that sort of thing. It's good to understand what you can afford. And again, your investment portfolio will have an influence on how these monies grow and what you can ultimately do. The last point I'll make on the investment topic is, and we talked a lot about the tax deferred bucket earlier when it comes to IRD assets, IRAs, 401ks. But that would be the pre-tax bucket. There's different tax attributes that apply based on the investment or account type that you own or inherit. And so there's this concept in investing called tax location, and you want to be smart and optimize the income tax situation for yourself as your portfolio generates interest, dividends, and capital gain distributions. So the idea here is that if you look at the three major tax buckets, you've got your pre-tax bucket, like we mentioned earlier, is taxable at ordinary income rates when withdrawals are made. Monies are dispersed to you from the bucket. You've got your taxable bucket in the middle, which are capital gains type assets. And the key difference there is that capital gains are realized when the asset is sold. And the capital gain is going to be the difference between the value at the time it's sold and what you paid for the asset. And I think, Mike, you talked about earlier the advantage of the step up in basis, right, to reset that capital gains treatment for those capital assets. The third bucket would be, of course, the Roth bucket, which is a tax-free bucket, which means that when you withdraw money from Roth IRA accounts, for example, there's no income tax due. It's a tax-free distribution to you. So you want to understand the different tax buckets available based on the account types that you own and orient your investments in each bucket to minimize the income tax. For example, we talked about fixed income investments, right? Bonds pay interest, and interest is taxable at ordinary income tax rates. So boy, wouldn't it be nice to allocate the fixed income or bond type assets to our pre-tax bucket, because those accounts grow tax deferred and I only pay tax when I withdraw money from the bucket. Or that's the idea. You want to get strategic, allocate your assets based on the income those underlying assets generate. Maybe orient some of the higher growth assets to the tax-free bucket to build that tax-free withdrawal source for you and your family in the future. So a couple of considerations there. And then, Mike, got about 15 minutes left in our planned program. I've got a couple topics we want to cover, but what are some good considerations for generational planning? Can you give us some insights there?
Sure. So now you've received the inheritance, you've looked at your portfolio, you understand sort of the estate tax and income tax consequences, the IRD, some of the strategies. It's time to remember, Dom and I are licensed to practice law in multiple states. So, you got to get you want to look at your estate plan and see whether it needs to be amended, how it should be amended, and sort of optimize the opportunities that you have, given the fact that you have different assets, different types of assets now, different valuation. You may trigger estate tax where you've not had it before. And so there's, this whole arena now of what do I do? I'm forward looking with my estate plan. The first thing I always like to remind people is, we have a tool, it's called the Trust and Estate Administrator's Guide, and you can identify, maybe you received an inheritance, maybe it's a coin collection, maybe it's a family heirloom. It's time to pass that family heritage on. It's time to pass on that value proposition. So keep notes, write letters to the next generation. There's a whole topic called ethical will making around sort of capturing, beyond the value of the asset itself, what this wealth means to the family or to the next generation. And so we always like to remind clients of that tool. It's great. Everybody ought to do it. And certainly when you have an inheritance or you even receive an inheritance, it's a good idea to optimize that by leveraging it for the next generation. Your grandparents left this to me. I'm leaving it to you. This is how, I would want you to use it consistent with how your grandparents would have wanted you to have those assets. So a strong parallel on the ethical estate planning side. Big topic is around asset protection. Then how are we going to keep these assets sort of in the family? And we've touched on this a little bit. A big part of that is the choice of the trustee. Okay. And again, the level of the assets. Maybe we want to make sure that these assets are available to be used for down payments on homes or weddings and things like that. But we don't want to muck it up with another family member as trustee. Maybe now we can afford a corporate trustee to take over at death, where previously we didn't think that might make sense. But maybe it's going to keep peace in the family. These are more significant assets. We don't want to have family conflict. You want to have family harmony. So how are we going to design the estate plan around that? And certainly it may change who acts as trustee. There may be additional assets now. How does that affect the next generation? Because if there's maybe there's a situation where a marriage may not seem as solid as it could. Do we need to do some planning around that? And again, it can be easily done, but you got to go back to the attorney, let them know what's transpired with respect to the inheritance, some of the new family circumstances, and update that estate plan. A good idea to do that, especially after you receive an inheritance, but certainly, changing family circumstances, or I would say, rule of thumb every 3 years or so. So that's kind of it on the trustee. You can layer those trustees as well between family members and corporate trustees. There are a lot of permutations you can add there as well. The next big thing is, okay, I've got asset protection for the next generation, but what's the distribution standard? There are a lot of different types of standards. This is how does the property come out of the trust, principal and income. Many people use a unitrust distribution structure, a 3% or a 5%. There's a lot of problems that exist within estate plans because they're flushing RMDs through, thinking pre-Secure Act when there would be this long stretch deferral. But now, since it's smashed into 10 years, we have large wholesale distributions potentially coming out for very young individuals, potentially grandchildren, if a child predeceases. So good time to look at those standards. 3% of 100,000 is a lot different than 3% for $500,000. Maybe you switch from a more liberal best interest standard to a tighter health, education, maintenance, and support standards. So you're going to shrink down that distribution to account for, the fact that you want to optimize the inheritance. You might get real particular about things that the assets can be used for in the way of a distribution standard. So again, the theme is that maybe you haven't paid attention to these things before, but you want to optimize them. You don't want to lose sight of, line of sight on your personal estate plan. And you could build into, as number 6 says here, maybe there's new intricate spray powers or limited powers of appointment, unique authority that you want to put into these trust relationships based on the additional assets that you have, that may make sense from a tax smart standpoint in the future. So just a couple of ideas around trustee and trust distributions. Anything there you think that I've missed, Dom, or worth adding?
No, one thing that you said really stuck out to me, and that's promoting family harmonies. And that is such an important value that we find that most of the families we work with have. So getting the right trustee succession, right? Thinking about the dynamics with your children, right? Within the confines of your own estate plan, critically important. And we're big on flexibility in planning. And there's this concept, Mike, that we bring up every so often, and it's called a trust protector. Could you speak to our audience a little bit about how a trust protector fits into their potential estate plan and whether that's something they should consider?
Sure. The trust protectors are probably one of the biggest, most contemporary issues, I would say, in estate planning. I've been practicing 31 or so years, and irrevocable trusts, back when I first started practicing, they were irrevocable, right? I mean, the only way to amend it was to go to court, a very expensive court proceeding. We started to develop some other processes to amend irrevocable trusts, decanting, where you decant from one irrevocable trust into another. That's called a decanting mechanism. Non-judicial settlement agreements. Some states have various statutory provisions which allow the amendment of an otherwise irrevocable trust with certain consent and notice and beneficiary structures. Again, they're statutory in nature, and they can provide a fair amount of hurdles to get through them. And so trust protectors are really sort of the next evolution of that. And what a trust protector is you embed with somebody, a family member, authority to do things that they may want to do or need to do, change the situs of a trust, to alleviate a onerous state income tax, to interpret a document, to avoid negative consequences because of changing family circumstances. So they can act as sort of the Supreme Court or third-party arbitrator. You don't need to go to court. You don't need to use decanting. You don't need to do a non-judicial settlement agreement. You can get where you need to go in a much easier fashion. So trust protectors are just a great tool to do that. If you're going to amend your estate plan from an optimization standpoint, again, I would give a lot of thought to implementing some trust protector provisions. The structure that I often see working best, again, depending on the family, is a corporate trustee for those irrevocable trusts downstream, but with a family member, trust protector who sits on the outside and can act as that ultimate deciding party. They don't have to get into the day-to-day involvement of distributions, decision making day to day, income tax filings, et cetera, but they have this great ability to fix things should some need arise in the future. So that's kind of it on trust protectors. A great optimization technique, I would say. So let's just summarize with some common pitfalls, and then we've got a couple of questions I'd like to get to. So real quick.
Yeah, and we touched on a few of these topics a little bit earlier. And these are just common missteps, mishaps, pitfalls that we see. The big one in the blue box is just missing required distributions. We spoke about the rules depending on what type of beneficiary you are. So really important to understand exactly what your situation is, exactly what RMDs or required minimum distributions you might need to make to avoid excise penalties and taxes. That's really the risk there. In the light blue box, one thing that is often important to people is, avoiding commingling inherited assets with marital assets. Generally speaking, if you inherit an asset during your lifetime, it's not by default considered marital property. And oftentimes people rush to settle estates and they're missing out on opportunities to segregate or keep those inherited assets separate in the event of a divorce, unfortunately. So slow down, speak with your attorney, your advisor, just to make sure that you're not making any mishaps, especially if you have concerns about your marital situation. Mike mentioned this earlier on the right-hand side, upper right in the red box. Make sure that cost basis is getting adjusted if those assets are capital gains assets that you inherit. Again, there's a little bit of an analysis that goes into it, but that's something we often see getting overlooked. And then you go to implement your new portfolio strategy with your advisor, and boy, now you're incurring capital gains that you shouldn't have because there was no adjustment made at the time of death. So you want to ask questions, right? Were these assets stepped up? Were they eligible for step? Just make sure that you're optimizing capital gains minimization. Good idea in the bottom left-hand corner to update the terms of your estate plan. Again, right? Your life changes over time. Children grow up. Relationships change between your loved ones. A significant inheritance can trip you into needing to do some advanced estate and gift planning. So it's good to make necessary updates, or at least understand what the terms of your estate plan are, so you're not missing out on any opportunities. And then the last topic is always a good idea to review your underlying insurance coverages and make sure that you have proper, property and casualty and umbrella type coverage to protect the assets that you've earned and inherited to the greatest extent possible. And let's cover, Mike, a few questions that we might have. And I think you've got a couple that you had in mind, Lisa.
Yeah, I see one that came up twice, so that we're going to take this one first, and that is, which state is the estate tax based on? The state of domicile of the beneficiary or the state of domicile of the decedent? It's of the decedent. It's not which state the beneficiary lives in. The taxing authority for state estate tax is the state of domicile of the decedent. So they're the ones that control that. So that's how that would shake out. Another question here on disclaimers, which is a great question. If you invoke the disclaimer strategy, can you direct those assets? Can you do the disclaimer and then direct those assets to which, but you cannot do that. If for example, an IRA and you're going to do a disclaimer, it's going to fall to the secondary beneficiary. So you got to, before you do the disclaimer, you got to know who the next in line is, and it could have a negative income tax consequence. So sort that out first. Because you cannot control the disclaimer. The disclaimer only works to keep it outside your estate, to block it, treat it as if you predeceased. You certainly don't want to end up in a estate situation. And you want to look, is this going to make it? It may make great sense if it's per stirpes, for example, and you want a piece of it to go to your children, to the grandchildren. You might disclaim 20%. Keep 80%. And if you have two children, you can say, hey, grandpa left you 10% of this IRA. Let's start a savings program. Let's start optimizing. Let's start learning about investments, or let's put this in a sheltered account for future use. Or maybe you don't have the ability to contribute to your own Roth or retirement accounts, but there's a disclaimer here of 20%, 10% each child. Now you've got the resources to optimize, and you're keeping it off the parent's estate. But that would be, if there were a per stirpes distribution, already in place. And in other words, you can't control the disclaimer, the direction of it, but boy, you can get some wonderful results if it's set up appropriately. And this is, again, a reason for people to have at the grandparent generation a solid estate plan, often considering disclaimers. I had one where we built it for an individual so that he can disclaim or not disclaim when his parents pass away and let it go into trust for his kids. It's just there. It's just laying in the parents' estate plan. So a powerful optimization technique. Do you see any questions that you like? I took a couple there, Dom. I could take another.
Yeah, one more. We get this one quite often, and this is just good generally, right? And it sometimes comes up when there's an inheritance situation because people might accelerate their retirement time frame or maybe gain some more confidence. But do I need to update my estate plan if I relocate to a new estate? And the answer that we typically provide is it's a great idea to update your estate plan. Number one, the terms might need to change anyway because your plan might be outdated for some of the reasons we had discussed earlier. And then it's just a good practice, right, to refresh your plan. You move to a new estate, get new power of attorney for property, healthcare documents using the statutory forms and your new state of domicile, right? The healthcare providers are going to be more familiar. You're going to want to change the administrative provisions potentially in your will or your trust. So, at bare minimum, at least consult, a qualified estate planning attorney and that new state of residence, get their opinion, but oftentimes it just makes sense to do the updates. I think, Mike, that's all the time that we have today for questions. If we weren't able to get to your question today, we do apologize, but you should see after the presentation ends a survey link pop up. Go ahead and put your questions in that survey link. Someone from Savant will reach out to you. And again, we thank you for your time. Hopefully it was informative. Check out our website at savantwealth.com to learn more and also to schedule a 15-minute complimentary call with us if you prefer to use that versus the link. Thanks again and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
If you enjoyed this webinar, visit savantwealth.com/guides and download our complimentary guidebooks, checklists, and other useful financial resources.